Greetings, everyone. Welcome to today's edition of The World Today. Better Dead Than Red, the enduring legacy of the Red Scare, with Clay Risen, based on his new book project on the history of the second Red Scare. And we'll get into what the difference between the first and the second Red Scare is in a moment. Clay is a reporter at the New York Times and a visiting fellow at Perry Worldhouse. Currently, he sits on the obituary desk at the Times. Previously, Clay worked on the opinion page as well as on the politics team. Clay is also the author of The Crowded Hour, Teddy Roosevelt, The Rough Riders, and The Dawn of the American Century, a New York Times notable book of 2019, and the subject of A World Today almost 2 years ago. In addition to The Crowded Hour, Risen is the author of two other acclaimed books on American history, A Nation on Fire, America in the Wake of the King Assassination, and The Bill of the Century, the epic battle for the Civil Rights Act. And because it's 5 o'clock somewhere, I'll add that Clay has also written widely on whiskey and other alcoholic spirits. He's the author of The Impossible Collection of Whiskey and Single Malt, a guide to the whiskeys of Scotland. Clay, a graduate of the Georgetown School of Foreign Service and the University of Chicago, joined Perry Worldhouse as a visiting fellow earlier this year. In addition to working on his book project and about the Red Scare, Clay is helping lead our graduate associates program, which includes grad students from each of Penn's grad schools who are interested in using their educations and training to shape international policy. Thank you, Clay, for taking the time to be with us here today to talk about your latest project. The floor is yours to make brief opening remarks.
All right. Well, thanks, John, and thanks to everybody at Perry Worldhouse for having me. Looking at the photo that you have attached for my headshot, I feel like this is maybe a case of false advertising. You know, anyone who came for the well-coiffed, trimmed Clay Risen instead of this shaggy mess, probably you come to the wrong place. But I'll do what I can to stand in for that guy.
It's just it's good to be reminded there's a pandemic going on. Clay.
Yeah, I know, right?
You just make it clear that we're all that some of us are just giving it a year just to let it grow.
You know, my wife likes it, so what can I say?
That's sounds good.
Yeah. Well, so I'll keep my remarks very brief because I think whatever I have to say will not be nearly as fruitful as what you and I can talk about, and hopefully what will come out of the Q&A. But I want to say, you know, sort of what the idea behind the book is, just kind of the meta aspect of it, because when I tell people that I'm writing this book, and I should say right now I'm researching the book. And so part of my difficulty is, you know, if anyone's ever written a book out there, and John, I know you have, I'm sort of at that very fragile place where I'm putting all the parts out on the table, but I haven't actually built it. And then to say, well, this is what it's going to look like is a little, you know, looking at all these parts and saying, no, someday it will be, you know, a motorcycle or whatever you're building. It can be a little tough. But when I tell people what I'm working on, there's usually sort of two responses. One, fortunately, most of the time people say, oh, that sounds great. I can't wait to read it. But I also from time to time get people saying, well, you know, why? Isn't that sort of settled history? Don't we already know about the Red Scare? That sounds so, you know, to them maybe sort of irrelevant to today. And, you know, that's not what I want to hear. But in some ways, it's actually a really, I think, affirming to what I'm trying to do, because my point is that that actually, you know, we have this story about the Red Scare, about you know, nationwide hysteria, about sort of the opening of vast amounts of state power to crack down on people because of their political, ideological beliefs, often people who didn't even have these beliefs, but were sort of suspected of having them, right? Just a rampant period of civil liberties abuse. And, you know, I think that's relevant to any time, but we've sort of forgotten why it's relevant today. And so part of my purpose is to take that period and to, without being really presentist about it, but to show what themes continue today. One of the problems, I think, with the Red Scare scholarship is it sort of stopped with the Cold War, the end of the Cold War. So, you know, the last really thorough, significant book on the Red Scare came out almost 30 years ago. And a lot of the scholarship and the sort of scholarly debates kind of stopped after a little bit after that, sort of trickling into the 2000s, but very much ending on this sort of almost a sort of détente, if you will, almost a Cold War among historians, if you will, where there's sort of this consensus that a lot of bad things happened, this sort of, let's say, liberal left consensus about the Red Scare. A lot of bad things happened. A lot of people were victimized. On the right, or it's not really the right, but they would say the revisionists, who have pointed out and drawn on post-Soviet archives, being the opening of Soviet archives after the Cold War, to say, well, there was a there. There was a reason why people were looking for communists, why they were worried about communists, because Alger Hiss was guilty, and we have the documents to prove it. We know the Rosenbergs were guilty. There's no debate here anymore, and so you're sort of stuck with these two sides that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but they're also somewhat in conflict. And as a result, it just sort of stayed there. And so that today, 20 years later, people look at it and don't really understand necessarily why it's relevant to contemporary issues, even though, like I said, a lot of people do kind of get it. They sort of understand intuitively why it's important to talk about some of the themes of the Red Scare. So my goal here is really to bring those out. And I think there are a few that I want to highlight. The first goal is really just to tell a narrative history. Even a lot of the general interest books that were written, up until the 1990s were thematic. And to pick them up today, I think requires a certain awareness or understanding, a certain intellectual context that people today don't have. They just, they don't necessarily understand the kind of references that you need to engage with a thematically constructed book. So what I want to do, if nothing else, is to provide just kind of a hopefully well-written, entertaining, engaging narrative primer about the Red Scare, so that people know what McCarthyism is. They know what the Hollywood 10, what HUAC was, these things. But it's not just that. It's also, I think, to show, first of all, I think what the Red Scare means more than anything, what it highlights is, not this one point in time when America kind of went haywire, but actually to show the mechanisms by which not only did the country fall into this period of civil liberties violations and sort of public hysteria and overarching state power, but that it can happen again today. And I think that we can have a historical examination of that period in a way that makes it clear why it could happen again. I think that the resonance, not just today, but say to the post 9/11 anti-Muslim hysteria, I think there's a lot of similarities there. So we can look at the 1940s and 1950s in a way that, without being presentist about it, makes it clear, how fragile we are as a country in terms of civil liberties and in terms of kind of political consensus around what's acceptable speech, what should be protected in terms of our ideological differences. And another theme I think that I want to bring out is, as I mentioned, the sort of the power of the state that was behind so much of the excesses of the Red Scare. Because we've forgotten a lot of the details, we tend to remember things like McCarthy and maybe some of the the more egregious examples of red baiting. But what was really dangerous was the things that are often forgotten, which are loyalty tests, for example, put in place by the State Department, other even branches of the federal government that have nothing to do with foreign policy, levels of state and local government. If you had communism in your background, you couldn't get hired as a dog catcher. And if you were a dog catcher and it came out that you had signed the wrong petition, your life might be ruined. You'd be fired and branded as a communist sympathizer. And this sort of state power, and this is to say nothing of the people who are prosecuted and sent to jail for essentially for being communists or for being communist sympathizers. This sort of exertion of state power is something that no doubt can still happen today. The state is much more powerful today than it was in the 1940s and 1950s. And that's where the concern is. McCarthy ultimately was a cheerleader for that. McCarthy himself wasn't really responsible for a lot of people going to jail or even having their lives. He was largely just throwing stuff against the wall. It was what was happening behind the scenes that was so relevant. And I think that's really important to keep in mind today. And the last thing I'd say is, a lot of the histories of the Red Scare, they're written in the 70s and 80s, they're very focused on kind of living history because it was living history. Most of the people involved, they were still alive. It was something that, was either, at its worst was score settling. And, but was very, very much invested in the kind of conversation that continued after the Red Scare. And so I think it's important now to be able to look back and say, with somewhat more objectivity, what was this really all about? And one of the things, among other themes that I want to bring out is, and it wasn't really discussed by a lot of the previous scholarship, is the impact that the Red Scare had on social movements. We tend to look at it as, tend to look at it in terms of individual victims, and that's important. There's some big name people who were brought down by the Red Scare, by red baiting, and it makes for pretty good stories. But there are a lot of people who, because they were Black, because they were gay, because they were a woman, and maybe held the wrong points of view or were vulnerable to some sort of charge, were attacked as communists. And I think this goes to a larger theme that so much of the Red Scare was about pushing back against social groups, social movements, social identities that had made significant progress in the 1930s and 40s and were facing a kind of revanchist sort of rearguard action. People who are trying to recover a lost American culture, or at least that they thought American culture had been, and they used communism as a way to push back against that. And again, I think that's a theme that is very relevant to us today, was maybe less relevant to people writing in a previous generation, but I think is what one of the things that motivates me in working on this book. So, again, as I said, this is all kind of parts on a table kind of conversation, and come back to me in a year, and hopefully it'll be at least have the engine block built. But I think, why don't we go to questions now, and maybe we can explore some of those ideas further.
Absolutely. Well, this is the process. So, this is the fun part. We've had you here for a book that's cooked and out, and we've got a great reception. And so we get the other end of the process, which is good to see. And I think it means that the questions here today can sort of influence the direction you take and guide it a little bit. And so I think you've just opened up a lot of really interesting ground here and made me think about 4 questions we didn't discuss in the course of our pre-conversation. I think the first piece of this is you sort of, I think, make a really compelling point that scholarship and understanding of the Red Scare really, the interest in it really ceased after the Cold War. And part of the problem with that is that it ties it, or at least suggests that it was all tied up in the Cold War when it wasn't. And part of that is due to the fact that you were talking about the second Red Scare here versus the first one, right? This is something that had happened in the country before. So I think tease those out a little bit for people here. And I think that gets to your point, which is this was much about politics and nationalism and some of these cultural issues and these cultural fights, as it was about the sort of long twilight struggle with the Soviet Union that sort of is so clearly is associated with this.
Yeah, so I that's another, when I mentioned that I'm writing this book, I get another pair of responses I get is if I say I'm writing a book about the Red Scare, inevitably someone says, oh, which one? And if I say I'm writing a book about the second Red Scare, inevitably someone says, wait, there was a first? So I can't really win. But yes, I mean, there was a first Red Scare immediately after World War I. And this was much shorter, much more focused, much more aimed at, in this case, very much aimed at immigrants or people of mostly of Eastern European and Southern European descent, who actually overlapped with a lot of the radicals, communists and anarchists active at the time. It was, as probably a lot of people are vaguely, at least vaguely aware of, in the immediate sort of just before in 1919, there was a series of bombings planted by anarchists in this case, but it made possible a series of raids across the country led by A. Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General, the Palmer raids. And ultimately, the attempted deportation of several hundred immigrants, naturalized citizens who were accused and charged of radicalism. But it lasted for a relatively short period of time. It was less than a year, and really sort of fizzled out after that. And yet, the idea that radicalism, left radicalism especially, was a danger remained. It was just sort of more sort of under the radar, and it wasn't really until after World War II that it bubbled back up in the second Red Scare, and that's a period when it lasted much longer. I would say you could measure it all the way from the late 30s until the late 40s. Certainly from 1946 until 1957. Clearly, that's the period of the Red Scare. Some people focus just on the McCarthy era, but the point is that the second Red Scare was much more multivalent. It took place at not only at the federal level but across states, down at the local level. I was serious about the dog catcher comment. I mean, PTAs, teachers, librarians, anybody whose name was found on a list. If you supported the wrong side, the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, you were a communist sympathizer because a lot of the Republicans were communists. So you were therefore not able to get a job as a teacher. So it was much more in the culture than the second Red Scare was, or the first Red Scare.
So if I can follow up on that a little bit, which is, and this is something we didn't discuss, but I will ask because you mentioned it in your opening remarks, which is in the Cold War, if you go now to then Warsaw Pact countries, Eastern, Soviet satellites and things along those lines, you can visit the museums to the Stasi, you can visit headquarters, you can go see the files. You can see the vast operations of that went into trying to maintain discipline, maintain the sort of effort to defeat, the effort to sort of at least come out victorious in the Cold War, all these sorts of things, right? Is a Red Scare really sort of a byproduct of sort of, is it the way a democracy polices itself without getting into those more official sort of things? Is this was this always going to be a part, and was this the most efficient, as horrible as it was, way to try and do this? Was there some necessary evil to this, or in a democracy, or is there a component to this that was just crazy conspiratorial piece of it?
I mean, yes, to say, there's a lot to piece apart there. So, first is the question of whether this was inevitable. I think it was inevitable for the United States. It's important to compare what America's experience was with, let's say, Britain. Certainly a lot of Western European countries, but let's say Britain, where there's a thriving communist party. Britain was lockstep with the United States in terms of its entrance into the Cold War, its engagement with the Cold War. But Britain never went through the kind of harrowing experience that we did. And there are, and I'm not really well versed in the kind of the comparative history here, but suffice to say that there are, I think, significant reasons why that was the case, and why the United States feels inevitable for America to have gone through the Red Scare. I think part of it is that, unlike Britain, we do have a tradition of anti-left radicalism in the United States, and that continues today. And it certainly was, something that during the Cold War was amplified. That's at the same time we have, a real adherence. We have a very strong sort of rearguard cultural front, as it were. And, as much today as we did, it takes different forms. Sometimes it's populism or nationalism, Americanism, America firstism. Sometimes the same terms are used at different periods to mean slightly different things. But certainly there is a very strong idea that the United States was a country of, white, heterosexual, largely led by men. And part of that was being, non-communist, and that was it was such a flexible term that it could mean a lot of things. So that sort of latency was always there, and I think made us sort of sitting ducks for this kind of reaction. I think it's hard to say would the exact same thing happen today. I'd always like to believe that we've learned our lessons, but my worry is that we haven't.
Do you, just to sort of build off that, do you believe, though, that some of the, at least as far as the US government was concerned, actually, this is a good question, which was, do you think there were some lessons learned and applied post 9/11 from the Red Scare in terms of official reactions to different ideologies, different religions, different ethnic groups and things along those lines? Or do you think that we fell into the same trap again?
No, I think one of the things that differentiates the period of time after 9/11 from the Red Scare is the strength of civil liberties organizations. And I think, not to single them out, the ACLU is a great example. I think one of the darker periods in the history of the ACLU was its compromise on red baiting and its willingness to sort of draw a line where certain people on the other side of it were considered fair game for red baiting, and the ACLU would not defend them and would not even include them in their membership. And they had their reasons, and I think that's a complicated history. But what you see in the 2000s, the context is different. All that aside, is organizations like the ACLU really coming out and erring on the side of defending civil liberties. Being willing to say, look, this person might be radical. This person might even be, under your strict definition, a threat, but the way you've constructed that threat is based on Islamophobia, is based on a fear that really doesn't have a place in American society. So we're going to defend this person, even though it is politically risky for us. And I think that's what was really necessary. And to see this on a bipartisan level, to see people who, certainly at the leadership of the Republican Party, President Bush, among others, coming out and drawing lines and saying, we are not going after Islam. We are not going after a religion. And that's something that just didn't happen in the Red Scare. And I think that's just, so, did people learn that lesson and apply it in the 2000s? I can't say for sure, but I think that's one important difference.
Yeah, and it held for a while. I think there's been some more radicalization. It would seem also that it was also a difference where the threat was versus home versus away.
Very different story.
Yeah. So I think one thing that, especially for younger students who might be listening in, is to really understand how big a part of the culture, the sort of fear and of communism, the anti-communism was as part of the Red Scare. It's actually, I think one of the virtues of this book is and this project is that that's really hard for people to appreciate when they sort of like hear about this. I always tell one story that it stands out from my youth. My father, who may be watching, you never quite know with my dad, but I played a practical joke on him one Christmas, and I pretended a present was going to be for my uncle, and it was actually for my dad. And so I wrapped it up and he gave it to him. And the minute he opened it on Christmas morning or Christmas Eve, I don't remember, he said, "Oh, you communist, you tricked me." And I was 5 or 6 at the time. But I think I tell that story because it sort of helps people understand that communist was a term that meant so much, right? It meant actual Soviet infiltrators and Soviet sympathizers, but then it also just became a term for, almost a slur for untrustworthy and things along those lines. And how did that happen? And how are you planning to sort of work through and explain the power that this term and this abuse, how it became so powerful in the culture?
I mean, just as an example, the Cincinnati Reds changed their name. They went by the Cincinnati Redlegs for a couple of years in the early 50s because they didn't want to be known as Reds. And my high school was called, our mascot was the Big Red, and we were the Big Maroon for about 10 years because of that. I also have a list. I don't know if I'll get through all these, but I have a video bibliography of about 100 movies that were made largely on the theme of anti-communism, sort of red baiting movies. There are, some of them are, none of them are particularly good, but there was a John Wayne made one. It was a way for a lot of actors in Hollywood, because so much of this is a Hollywood story too. It was a way for Hollywood actors to kind of give their bona fides. I'm not a communist. I made this movie that is all about beating up communists. Mickey Spallane, the biggest novelist, arguably, of the 1950s. Mike Hammer was an he went and killed communists. That was one of the themes of Mike Hammer's books. And so, that's just a taste of how significant a part of the history, part of the culture it was. To explain how it got there, I think, one thing is, of course, as I mentioned, there's this sort of undercurrent of anti-radicalism running through American culture, but also, it's important, and it's hard for us almost 100 years later to appreciate how radically different American culture in 1946 was from American culture from America in 1926, let's say, or even 1936. The country had been through a rapid period of urbanization. It was in the middle of assimilating tens of millions of immigrants who had arrived in the early part of the 1900s. Those were being assimilated, changing the culture, technology, urbanization, and then the Depression, the New Deal, and finally World War II. All of these things completely rewrote American culture, so that by 1946, you have a culture that is, on the one hand, freed from the war, feeling somewhat dominant, having won the war, but also very unsure of itself. Very unclear what that culture was. And the same thing with our politics. You had a politics that went back, from 1932, totally dominated by the Democrats, and largely dominated by one man, dominated by Franklin Roosevelt. So by 1946, you have a Republican Party that's looking for any way to get back into power. You have a Democratic Party that is led by Harry Truman. No one knows who he is. On the one hand, you have Strom Thurmond in the party, but also Henry Wallace. And so it's this party that is in power, but doesn't really know what it is. And you have both parties trying to redefine a domestic politics and looking for ways to do that. And communism presents itself as this kind of boogeyman precisely because there were not that many communists, especially by 1946. There were so few. It was, at most, maybe 50,000. But a lot of those were people who kind of cycled through one year. They decide the party was not very well run, and it was very authoritarian. So it just wasn't a very fun place to be. And it was rapidly declining. So because of that, you could kind of use the term to apply to anything. You could call anybody a communist precisely because almost nobody was a communist. And, the last thing I'd say is just, even though we were out of the war, because of the strictures of Depression life and then war life, people were still locked in a kind of mindset of antagonism, of black and white, of annihilationist thinking. We had to, during World War II, absolutely destroy the Germans and the Japanese. And so it can be very difficult to pull out of that. And so I think people were very comfortable with the idea of a new enemy. Certainly the Soviet Union presented that in foreign policy terms, but also here was a convenient way to talk about it in domestic policy terms too.
No, it's great. You've mentioned this, but there were other scares associated with the Red Scare as well, and the Red Scare sort of became, and the fear of communism and anti-communism movements were weaponized against a broad spectrum of mostly progressive movements, right? Civil rights leaders and civil rights movement, gay rights, women rights, things along those lines. One issue close to my own research is that the first national security advisor was gay, Jim Cutler, Dwight Eisenhower's national security advisor. But in the name of national security, and abutted by the Red Scare and the force it carried within government and in Washington, he helped oversee one of the sort of more damaging parts of what was then known as, and still known as, the Lavender Scare, which was about sort of pushing homosexuals and gay individuals out of government and punishing them and getting them out of national security and things along those lines. He helped sort of author one of the sort of major pieces of regulation that sort of helped push those people out, even though being gay himself. How was this used, and how did the Red Scare, was the Red Scare really about that, or was that just used as the sort of inspiration for these other movements?
Well, I think it's one strand of the Red Scare. It's part of the story. So, precisely because communism could mean a lot of things, and had weight, however you used it, it was a great weapon to deploy against groups that seem to be part of that redefining of American culture and redefining of American politics. And so, one of those changes was the increased space for groups that previously had been marginalized. And this was everything from the labor movement to African Americans and people of color and women, gays, largely gay men, gays and lesbians to some extent. But in some cases, their gains were ephemeral or not really, weren't recognized in law. If you were a gay man in Washington in the 1930s or 40s, you had more freedom. There's a lot of great documentation of what it was like to be gay in New Deal / World War II Washington. You could be, if not totally out of the closet, at least much more open and a little less worried about being arrested for being gay than you might have earlier. If you were in a labor union, you actually did have rights that were put in place and under the New Deal, and so you could you actually really felt like you were making advances, and that all came crashing down after the war, and it's precisely because there were people who were trying to redefine and grab and pull back the culture. And so one of the things that you see is an attempt to define all of these things, being a civil rights activist, being a feminist, being gay, as being communist, or at least vulnerable to communism. So just to focus on the Lavender Scare, one of the things that was often said was, if you're gay, you were either vulnerable to blackmail, or as a gay man, you were sort of given to radicalism. That there was something about being gay that made you open to left-wing radicalism. And so, for both those reasons, you were a security threat, and people were hounded out of government for that. There was one of my favorite examples is and probably a guy who will feature in the book is a State Department and then CIA figure named Carmel Offie, who had this great story. He had built himself, didn't go to college, or he had 2 years of business college, but managed to rise up in the State Department as very, very smart, very talented guy, spoke several languages, got to be friends with John F. Kennedy when when Offie was attached to the embassy in Paris, got to know Kennedy before the war, later became kind of an early Russia hand, and really indispensable and ironically a very ardent anti-communist. And yet when it came out that he was not just gay, but very much, it was known that he was gay. Kennedy knew he was gay, and Kennedy was a fairly open in his letters, writing about his friend Carmel Offie, who was gay. But when that came out, and when the kind of the hammer came down, Offie was one of the first people to be hounded out of government, the first of hundreds. And the irony being that we lost. If you were really concerned about communism and you were really concerned about the threat from the Soviet Union, you wanted a guy like Carmel Offie on the front lines. And instead we got rid of him because he was gay and because he was considered to be a security threat. But really in the end, what he represented was a different America from the one that the Red Baiters were trying to rebuild.
All right, that sounds good. Well, we'll continue the conversation with some of the questions from our audience here today. The first is, pretty basic, which is, are we about to sort of see another Red Scare in the United States? And I'm going to add a wrinkle to that, which is, which do you think is more likely to start a new Red Scare in the United States over communism? The rise of China, or the sort of massive sort of COVID stimulus bills that have reasserted the federal government's role in domestic economy and domestic affairs?
Yeah, so I'll start with the old adage, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, right? So are we about to see another Red Scare? No, if what you're looking at is something that very closely repeats what happened in the 40s and 50s. But I do think that we already see themes emerging out of that period that resonate today. So, first and foremost being what we just went through with the rise of a demagogue in American politics. And much more than we saw in the 40s and 50s. This is somebody who captured the presidency and essentially ran the country for 4 years, and it still claims the loyalty of millions of Americans. So he sort of out McCarthy, but there are all kinds of parallels between what McCarthy did to gain his position in American political culture and what Trump did. So we already see that. We also see the continued resonance of communism and socialism as a slur, and the insistence that those are somehow un-American values and un-American ideas. That, I think, will continue to be a trope. I mean, it can't not, given kind of where we are. But I think what worries me the most is what may happen with regards to China. Because to go back to what I said earlier, the really fundamental thing about the Red Scare that we need to be worried about is the capture of state power in the hands by people who will use it as a tool against political enemies. And I think for that to happen, there needs to be some sort of sense of, a real threat to the country in national security terms. I think that the Red Scare wouldn't have happened the way it did had the Soviet Union not been at the front of everyone's mind as the new enemy. And I think that China stands to become that new enemy. You can imagine the scenarios. It wouldn't even take an invasion of Taiwan, but certainly we're only 1 or 2 crises away from a point where anyone who's ever worked with a Chinese company anyone who's ever been in a cultural exchange, anyone who's ever, God forbid, had an academic relationship with a Chinese university. We already see this happening. People who are hauled in or questioned by the FBI because of some relationship with a Chinese academic institution. And so I think we could see more and more of that, and all it would take would be some grandstanding senators, some ideological governors to really start to make this very uncomfortable for millions of Americans who have very legitimate ties with China. And I think the other thing that adds to this, which you didn't see so much in the Cold War, is a racial element. And the Cold War was largely, while you had sort of a racial element with civil rights, you didn't have a kind of othering, this sort of national security tie-in that you did have with the first Red Scare. And I think that you could that we're already seeing coming up from the grassroots, people attacking people of Asian descent, Americans of Asian descent, because of what they look like and where their families came from. And so, all those parts are there, and that's what worries me the most.
That's great. So I think piecing together a few of the questions in the chat, we're seeing, as you say, some stirrings, right? And I think many of these are in conservative media about, accusations of communism, whether it's the vilification of politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the academy, right, and universities, or even institutions like your own, the New York Times. Does the fragmentation of the American media in the 21st century, our current fragmentation, change the potential power of these sort of charges and the potential power of a new Red Scare? And does it change the potential impact of it?
Yeah, I think it makes it much dangerous. I think that during the Red Scare, one of the bulwarks was the existence of a fairly narrowly defined national media, a couple of leading newspapers and a couple of television networks, radio networks. These really dominated the national discourse. At the same time, again, there are parallels and resonances between then and today. Even though you had these kind of dominant media, you also had a lot of alternative media. One of the things that I find as I go through the archives is the various archives around the country is the prevalence of newsletters, and newsletters that had tens of thousands of people subscribing to them. They would go out once a month. A lot of them very low tech, printed on 3 or 4 pages, sometimes stapled, sometimes double folded, but they would be very powerful. They would be what today we would call, doxing. These would be newsletters that would say sometimes, here's a list of the people who failed our own loyalty test, and therefore, they're actors or they're government officials. Other times they would be screeds, going after, world government or Harry Truman or whatever. But these were very widely read. They weren't as widely read as say the New York Times, but they were very much part of the current of the Red Scare and the kind of conversation of the Reds around anti-communism, this sort of extreme anti-communism. And so that I think that we see the same sort of thing happening today. And what we also see is I'd like to say the media is a little savvier than it was in 2016, but you also see a willingness on the part of mainstream media to kind of, treat everything that gets said by figures like Trump as newsworthy. Again, I think we're a little better about that than we were a few years ago, but that's exactly what people like McCarthy rode to power in the Red Scare. And again, I think we see it today. It's hard. It's a legitimate question. What do you cover and what do you not cover? But I don't think we have quite the best answer yet. And that's being that's facilitating again this sort of, or it gives an avenue to a new kind of red baiting or a new let's call it China baiting or whatever it's going to be. So, I think that there are, so just to, to kind of summarize a bunch of different thoughts, I think that, yes, there are similarities between then and today. And what's worrisome is that those similarities are much more likely, much more a part of the media landscape today than they were in during the Red Scare. And so much more likely to exacerbate fear-mongering, hysteria, conspiracy theories than they were even in at the height of the Red Scare.
Right. So this is an interesting question. We get it sort of from two different sides in the chat, which I think is this question of I'm going to try and combine these, which is why is there greater comfort or perhaps greater fear of left-wing radicalism, right? Communist radicalism, communist infiltration of government, and less concern over some of the sort of more conservative right-wing extremism that we see. And some of these questions are directed at me because I've worked at the Defense Department. I do find it interesting that, that the questions about on your security clearance and other things that are about your, loyalty to the government are very often directed more towards left-wing organizations like communism or other ideologies, and have much less to do with some of the sort of more conservative and more right-wing things that we've seen actually try to, in some cases, violently attack the U.S. government. And so why is it that this left-wing fear and left-wing paranoia drives this much more so than the right wing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we are fundamentally a conservative country in that we have a fairly strong founding myth, a fairly strong sense of kind of founding identity, with all the caveats that come with that. It is not representative of even most Americans today. It has all kinds of flaws. And yet, for millions of Americans, it's a very compelling story. And I think for deep historical reasons, the right generally and the far right specifically have managed to establish themselves as the defenders of that identity. And so that anything that comes along and says, well, we'd like to do things differently, is automatically considered a threat and the other, even if it's domestic, even if it's someone like, Eugene V. Debs and Midwestern socialism, is still, as much as that was a homegrown radicalism, as much as he was a homegrown radical, he was often, depicted as a change agent, obviously, and therefore a threat to the establishment. And so I think it's honestly nothing more than that. That structure then becomes articulated and weaponized against anybody who represents change. So you could be a feminist, be, an LGBTQ activist. You could be, a civil rights activist, a union organizer. Any of that can be construed as against the establishment is cast out. And anything that's construed as in defense of the establishment, even if it is white supremacist, even if it is, radically exclusionary, even if it is deeply racist or misogynist, is at least in defense of the establishment. I think that, on a kind of almost lizard brain level, that's how it works in the American mind. And, it's why I think it's endured for, well over 100 years, and why it will continue, this kind of, sort of natural anti-left radical sentiment. It's a long
That's great. One group you didn't mention in there, and this is a question from the chat, which I think is interesting, because we're living at a moment where science and technology are driving a lot more of the policy decisions, and to some extent driving some of the sort of political divides that we're facing, whether it's vaccines, whether it's pandemics, masks, whether it's environmentalism and climate change, things along those lines. Were environmentalists targeted back in the 50s and 40s and 60s? And do you see and potentially see that as one of the dividing lines that we could possibly see in this Red Scare? We sort of see that sometimes with some of the response to environmental policies, right? Like, the Green New Deal and things along those lines, which had some components that were driven in part by environmentalism, and climate change being sort of accused of communist takeover and things along those lines. How did that play back then, and how do you see it playing today?
Yeah, it didn't really play back then because this was all, this was before Silent Spring. This was before there was really an emergence of any kind of environmental consciousness. Even a sort of the new wave of conservation consciousness, like Lady Bird Johnson's conservationism in the 1960s. I also think that environmentalism is a tricky one because setting aside the kind of radical environmentalists or the sort of, I hate to use the word extreme or even radical, but let's say, the sort of movement environmentalism, concern about the environment broadly doesn't necessarily cut along ideological lines. You have a lot of people who are on the right who are concerned about conservation, who are concerned about clean waterways. You have people like Theodore Roosevelt in their history who articulated and put in place conservation as a value in the federal government. And I don't mean to say that it's equally split. It's a left, right, all come together, kumbaya kind of thing. But I think it's a little more complicated than some other areas of divide. So I think it would be hard to see that emerging as a focus for some kind of new, let's say green baiting, as it were, movement. But I do think at the points where it intersects with other things, so the idea of racial environmental justice or feminist environmentalism, these things are places where environmentalism becomes just kind of this added term, right? So the Green New Deal is targeted in part because it's associated with AOC and because it's associated with racial justice and because it's associated with all these other things, as well as being seen as, or as being depicted as a kind of overweening federal power in the offing. So, it's not to say that in this hypothetical new Red Scare that then environmentalism wouldn't be a theme in there, but I don't see it as something that on its own could be the catalyst or the target.
All right, that's great. So when can we expect this book on our bookshelves? Are we thinking like 6 months, a year?
Another couple of years. I mean, one of the things that's been difficult with COVID is that all the archives have been shut down. And so I had 2020 was supposed to be my big archive year where I would take a bunch of weeks, go visit all, spend time in DC and then Boston. There's some archives out on the West Coast that I need to visit. And none of that happened. And of course, you can imagine most of the stuff's not online. It's all archives. So that I've been able to do other things, do some secondary reading, and there are some archives and newspaper archives online. So it's not that I haven't been able to do anything, but the meat of the project in terms of the material that I want to work with, I still have to go get. I feel like after that, I can start to assemble things. So, give it another couple of years. It's not something I want to spend the rest of my life on. But I will also say that one of the difficulties of this project, or challenges, opportunities, it's a fun challenge, is where to draw the line, what to talk about. I'm not writing a textbook, and I'm not writing what I think will be the comprehensive history. What I really want to do is write a book that, again, through a narrative, really gives the themes of the Red Scare, but doesn't feel the need to check every box, to mention every name, to mention every facet of the Red Scare. What I hope is that people come away from it with an understanding of what the Red Scare was and some sense of why it's relevant today. And so getting to the point where I'm comfortable doing that will take a couple more years, but hopefully not more than that.
All right, that's great. Well, we look forward to it, and we wish you luck, and we'll be here ready to read and ready to talk about it when you're done. So thank you so much, Clay, for what was a fascinating discussion and for taking the time to speak to us about the enduring legacy of the Red Scare. a genuinely important and urgent topic, and one that even if history doesn't repeat itself, I think all of us will be thinking about how it's rhyming as we read our newspapers, visit social media, visit with family members in the months and years ahead. And thank you to everybody for joining us today, for logging on to this edition of the World Today, and for engaging with questions and comments in the discussion forum. We hope you will join us again on Friday, April 16th, for a discussion with Rohingya activist Wei Wei Nu on COVID-induced crises and refugee women's livelihoods. And then for the next edition of the World Today on Tuesday, April 20th, on US-China relations and the Biden administration. We'll put these links in the events to these events in the chat, and you can log on and sign up to attend those events. As always, you can access a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel, and you can find out about all the great events we have planned for this semester, the rest of this semester, and looking at the fall by joining our mailing list and following us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We'll drop links to all of that in the chat as well. Thank you again for being with us here today. We look forward to seeing you on Friday for the next World Today.